Hi everyone. So we're going to be talking about battery life on the Galaxy S6 and S6 Edge. A lot of people have been concerned that the smaller battery in the S6 is going to cause them a problem. Now, battery life is a very subjective thing. Everybody uses their devices differently for different levels of time, doing different types of tasks. So it's not always easy to kind of draw a definitive from this necessarily. But what we can do is discuss what you can do to save battery life and the things that impact on your battery during a day-to-day operation. Now, one of the first things to always be aware of is what options your actual Android operating system has, and specifically from the Galaxy S6, to save you battery life. So, some of the things you can kind of do here. If you come into battery, we can go in here. Oops. If we go into battery, hit the right option this time, we can see how much battery we have left, and then we've got a couple of options here. Now, power saving mode will eke out some additional battery essentially by lowering the brightness of the screen, the CPU, turning off things like vibration, the touch lights, and so on. Basically anything kind of unnecessary that you don't need just to use the device. The optional extras, the bells and whistles, effectively can be turned off. Now you can set that to come on at any point you want, or immediately, so run it all the time. I tend to leave mine at 20%, give me an additional 10% battery power once we get to that point. So it hits 20%, and realistically, once it goes into this lower power mode, I have around 30% of battery left. The other option is ultra power saving mode. Now this one turns off basically the entire Android operating system other than a basic overlay that provides access to your phone, your text messages, and basic functionality. I mean, this really does turn your smartphone back into a dumb phone for all intents and purposes, but in doing so you will dramatically increase the battery life. But let's talk about the things that really impact battery, because it might not always seem quite so obvious. For instance, you'll be aware that running the screen, actually having the screen turned on, is probably the biggest single drain you will have on a smart device. But also it goes a little bit further than that, because depending on what your device is doing, so for instance if you're playing a game, you're running the CPU and the screen simultaneously, and that is going to increase the battery life, decrease the battery life. But likewise, if you happen to be playing that game multiplayer, you're also running the Wi-Fi or your cell at the same time. Again, you've added to that battery drain. But there's something you might not be aware of. If you happen to have a weak Wi-Fi signal or even a weak cell signal, your device will use more power to maintain a signal lock. Now, what does this mean? Well, in real terms, if you say only have 1 or 2 bars of cell or 1 or 2 bars of Wi-Fi, the phone will use more power thinking it needs a stronger signal, and in doing so, it will drain the battery more. You can know this, and you'll have experienced it yourself, because if you've ever been out in the countryside with just 1 bar, you might have thought, hang on, why is my battery running down so quickly? You've gone out for the day and it's only lasted 4 hours instead of 8. It hasn't been an app left on in the background, it's the fact that your cell has essentially been trying desperately to keep a strong or as strong a signal it can onto a cell tower, and to do so, it's had to boost more power through that transmitter and receiver. Essentially, the best way to try and keep your battery life running as peak performance during the day is to keep one eye on how well your device is connecting to Wi-Fi and cell. Obviously, if it's sat in your pocket, it still needs to be talking to the cell network to receive notifications. To do that, it has to have a strong signal as it perceives it. So if you happen to be in a rural area, consider whether you actually need the cell turned on anyway to receive notifications for a couple of hours. Take some time to walk in the countryside and just disconnect. You'll find that if you keep one eye on that cell and Wi-Fi there and how strong those signals are, especially if you're someone who moves around a lot between cell sites or between Wi-Fi sites, say between in a building or in a town, you might find, because you're constantly connecting and disconnecting from weaker signals, that your battery is not lasting as long as it could do. But what else can we do to kind of help our battery life? Well, also always take a look at what your auto brightness is doing, because in different scenarios you might find that actually the auto brightness is over-governing the screen and actually running it hotter than it needs to, effectively draining your battery when it just doesn't need to. You can see here I've actually got 2 very, very large 5,000 watt bulbs right now coming onto this desk, and yet the auto brightness still thinks it needs to be pumped up massively high It doesn't. In actual fact, I could turn that off and drop it down to about there. And for me, personally, still looking at this device, I can still see everything on the screen. Maybe not quite so easy for you at home, but my point is quite simply that the auto brightness on most smartphones isn't actually very good. It doesn't tend to actually pick up ambient light quite as well as it picks up direct sunlight. Again, that may mean that you're running your screen brightness much higher than it really does need to be comfortable to read the screen, but also to preserve your battery life. Your other things is location, location, location. You'll have heard this many times before, but just watch out for what your location settings are actually doing, because if you happen to have GPS, Wi-Fi, a GPS turned on, and cell location turned on simultaneously, you're effectively hitting your system with a triple whammy of location lookups. What will first happen is it will try and grab a GPS, requiring quite a lot of power. It can't get a GPS because there's cloud cover, it's wasted that power. Instead, it will then switch to Wi-Fi. Your Wi-Fi signal's not good enough, you've wasted some power there, so then we'll switch to cell. And cell, well, yeah, it'll always be able to triangulate using a GPS and Wi-Fi to get you a fix. However, you've just used a redunculous amount of power in a very short period of time just to find out where you are. In actual fact, you might very well have been better off turning off GPS, turning off Wi-Fi, and just using the AGPS triangulation from your cell sites. In most cases, that will actually provide a pretty good lock-on for what you need, and it hasn't required 3 attempts to get there, each one using progressively less power as it got down the line. So there's a quick and simple and dirty look at things you can do to preserve battery life, not just on a Galaxy S6, but actually on any smartphone, be that an iPhone or an Android device or even a Microsoft Lumia. At the end of the day, keeping one eye on what the device is actually doing at different points during your journey and your daily routine could help you eke out 10 to 15% more battery just by being a little bit proactive.